The afterlife. It's one of those things, that's both kind of terrifying, but also completely fascinating, right?
Mm.
I mean, when we think about the Romans, we often picture togas and gladiators. But their vision of the underworld was way more than just fire and brimstone. It was really a reflection of their entire world tied to their everyday lives.
Absolutely. And forget any simple ideas of heaven and hell. The Roman underworld, it was all about these cycles, balance, and this deep connection to the earth. It's almost like they saw death not as this ending, but as a continuation, just in a different form.
Okay, so let's break that down. We've got to start with Pluto, right? The big guy in charge down there. He always seems to get a bad rap, seen as this dark, brooding figure. But there's more to him than that, right?
Oh, always. For one thing, Pluto wasn't just the god of the underworld. He was linked to wealth, too. And not just any wealth. I'm talking about the riches that came from the earth itself.
Yeah.
Precious metals, fertile soil, the very things that sustained Roman society.
So he wasn't some distant, vengeful god. He was this powerful force that was actually woven into the fabric of their lives, which I find fascinating because if you think about it, Roman art rarely actually shows Pluto directly.
Hmm.
Why were they so hesitant to actually visually represent such an important figure?
I think it speaks volumes about how they dealt with death. The Romans, they understood it was inevitable. They had these elaborate rituals for navigating it, but there was this reluctance to really dwell on the morbid parts. They preferred to emphasize honor, balance, and making sure the deceased made a smooth transition into this next phase of existence.
And when we're talking about dramatic transitions, the story of Pluto and his wife Proserpina definitely takes the cake. I mean, we're talking divine kidnapping, right? But there's got to be more to it than just some, godly soap opera.
Oh, absolutely. The story of Proserpina's abduction. It's one of those myths that really gets at their deeper fears and beliefs. On the surface, it seems like it's just this powerful god taking what he wants. But when you bring in Proserpina's mother, Ceres, the goddess of agriculture, it takes on this whole other dimension.
Right, because Ceres is devastated when Pluto, kidnaps her daughter and takes her down to the underworld. So what happens to the Roman world when the goddess of agriculture is, basically heartbroken?
Think about it. Crops fail, right? Winter sets in. It's clearly an allegory for the cycles of the seasons, but it also shows how deeply the Romans linked their faith to both nature and the gods. It wasn't just a story, it was woven into their understanding of life, death, and even how their society survived.
Okay, so let's say you're a Roman citizen, just, living your life. You're aware of these myths, these beliefs about the underworld. Then, the inevitable happens, you die. What did they believe happened next? What was the soul's journey like?
Well, first things first, you'd need to get past the ferryman. Charon, remember him?
Right. The guy who rows the souls across the River Styx. And you need that coin to pay him. I'll be honest, I always figured that was just a symbolic thing.
It was symbolic, sure, but to the Romans, it was also practical. See, they were really big on having the proper burial rites. They really believed that if a soul wasn't sent off correctly, or if, say, Charon didn't get his payment, then that soul, it could become this restless spirit, unable to find peace. And trust me, you did not want to be on a restless Roman spirit's bad side.
That's both fascinating and kind of spooky at the same time. So let's say you pay the ferryman, cross the River Styx. Then what? What's waiting for you on the other side? Was it like, welcome to the underworld, here's your harp?
Not quite. This is where that Roman sense of order, and let's face it, their love of bureaucracy really comes in. The underworld, it wasn't just one big afterlife hangout. They had a whole system. You'd be facing the three judges of the underworld, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aegus, and each one of them had a say in what your final destination was going to be based on how you lived your life, of course. No pressure or anything.
Let's talk about an intimidating job interview. So no harp right away. What were these judges like? Did they each, have their own category of sins they judged, or?
It wasn't quite as specialized as that. Think of it more like a panel of judges, each with their own reputation. You had Minos. He was the head honcho, known for being wise and fair. Then there was Rhadamanthus, and he was all about strict justice. No leniency there. And last but not least, Aegus. He was like the gatekeeper, the one who literally held the keys to the afterlife.
So based on their judgment, where could you end up? I mean, everyone hopes for the best, right?
If you were lucky enough to be considered worthy, you might find yourself spending eternity in Elysium. Think of it as the VIP section of the afterlife. Beautiful fields, feasts with heroes. Pretty delightful all around.
Sign me up. But let's be real, not everyone's getting into Elysium. What about the people who weren't exactly heroes, but weren't evil either? Where do they end up?
Well, that's where the fields of Asphodel come in.
Asphodel, what is that, like a waiting room?
Not quite. Think of it more like a neutral zone. It wasn't paradise, but it wasn't punishment either. You'd basically be spending eternity with countless others, just living out this peaceful, although maybe a little uneventful, existence.
So kind of a cosmic middle ground, you could say. You get what you deserve, but nothing too extravagant either way. Which, of course, brings us to the, shall we say, less desirable option, the one no one really wants to dwell on.
Ah, yes. Tartarus.
Right, Tartarus. That was the place reserved for the truly wicked. The ones who defied the gods, committed unspeakable acts. You know, the people who really threw off that balance of justice.
Let's just say you wouldn't want to run into anyone from Tartarus during your afterlife commute. Speaking of which, we should talk about those rivers of the underworld. Everyone knows about the River Styx with Charon and everything, but the Romans had a whole network of rivers down there, right?
They did. And each river, it wasn't just some random geographical feature. Each one represented a different emotional state, like a stage in the soul's journey.
So they took emotional baggage pretty literally. Something like that.
Okay, so we got the River Styx, the border between the living and the dead. What else is on this map of underworld emotions?
Well, there's the Charon, the river of sorrow, often shown as just a river of, well, pure sadness and regret.
So that's a cheerful image.
It represented all the grief and regret that souls would carry with them as they entered the afterlife. And then there's the Lethe.
The river of forgetfulness. That's the one you always hear about. You drink from it and you forget all your earthly troubles, right? Although, honestly, forgetting your whole life, even the good parts, that's kind of a scary thought.
It makes you wonder just how bad things must have been for some people that they'd rather just forget it all. But there's also this sense of wanting a clean slate, a fresh start. In some versions of the myth, souls would actually drink from the Lethe before being reborn, you see, so they'd be ready to begin a new life without any of that baggage.
Like hitting the cosmic reset button. What other rivers are we navigating in this underworld?
We can't forget the Phlegathon. Now this one's a bit intense. A river of fire, often linked to the idea of purification.
I was just thinking that fire doesn't sound very relaxing.
It's about burning away the impurities of your earthly life, you see.
Okay, yeah. I can see that fire as this cleansing force. But I have a feeling it wasn't all symbolic with the Phlegathon.
Right, again. The Phlegathon wasn't just for spiritual cleansing. It had a darker side too, especially down in Tartarus. There, the river of fire, it was a tool for punishment.
Ah, so no fire without a bit of brimstone after all.
Exactly.
And then there's Kitzitis, right? That name always makes me think of something awful.
The river of wailing. Not exactly a peaceful place for afterlife relaxation. Imagine endless sounds of mourning, souls lamenting their lost lives, all their regrets and missed chances.
Yeah, let's move on from that teary thought. But you're right, each river, even the scarier ones, they add a whole other layer to how the Romans understood the afterlife, right? It wasn't just a single destination, it was a whole process, a journey filled with all these emotional transformations.
Exactly. It wasn't about getting away from all those feelings. It was about facing them head on, dealing with them, and hopefully finding some peace in the end.
And speaking of finding peace, let's talk about how the living tried to make that transition easier for their loved ones. We got to talk about Roman funerals because they really went all out.
Oh, they did not hold back. And it makes sense when you think about how crucial those rituals were for ensuring that a soul would have a safe journey into the afterlife. Remember, messing up the burial rites, that could have some really bad consequences.
Right, because nobody wants to end up a restless spirit wandering the earth just because, I don't know, their family didn't use enough incense at their funeral. So paint us a picture. What did a proper Roman funeral actually look like?
Well, it really depended on things like the family status and wealth. But generally, Roman funerals were these huge events. You'd have all these mourners, sometimes even professionals, who would be wailing and lamenting, really emphasizing the sorrow of the loss.
That sounds like a rough job, honestly.
Then there was the procession itself. The body would be carried through the streets, usually on this elaborate platform called a bier. And it was accompanied by family, friends, and sometimes even actors who would wear masks that looked like the family's ancestors.
So it was almost like this theatrical performance of grief and remembrance in a way.
That's a great way to put it. It was about publicly honoring the dead, reminding everyone about their life and accomplishments, and then, of course, there were the offerings.
Right. You can't send someone into the afterlife empty-handed. So what were some of the essential items on the Roman underworld packing list?
Coins were a must-have, obviously, for that ferry ride across the River Styx. You got to pay Charon, right? But they also offered food, like honey cakes. Those were a symbol of sweetness and nourishment for the journey ahead. Wine was common too, partly as an offering to the gods, and partly just to share one last drink with the deceased.
I actually find that kind of beautiful, providing for them in death just like you did in life.
It is. And what about flowers? I mean, even in death, who doesn't appreciate a nice bouquet? Flowers were a really common offering, symbolizing beauty, life, and that whole cyclical nature of existence that the Romans were so drawn to. And they would sometimes put personal items in the tomb too, things that were meaningful to the deceased when they were alive, things like jewelry, weapons, maybe tools from their profession. It was almost like they were trying to make the afterlife a little less foreign, a little less final.
Like sending them off with a little piece of their life so it wouldn't feel so unfamiliar.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. Families would actually visit the tombs, bring more offerings, share news, almost like they were still keeping in touch. It was all about remembering, honoring, and making absolutely sure that even in death, their loved ones were never forgotten.
Which I think makes all those inscriptions on the Roman tombs even more powerful.
Hmm.
Because they weren't just names and dates on a headstone.
Right. Not at all. Think of those inscriptions as messages for the living, reminders to honor the dead and keep their memory alive. Sometimes they were like boasts about the person's accomplishments and virtues, the things they wanted to be remembered for. And sometimes those inscriptions included curses.
Wait, curses? As in, like, may bad things happen to you, curses. Who exactly were they cursing, grave robbers?
You got it, grave curses.
Oh.
Meant to protect the tomb from vandalism or robbery, a warning to anyone who might disturb the deceased's peace.
So more like, mess with his tomb and you'll be answering to Pluto himself.
Exactly. It was all about invoking the power of the gods, the underworld, and even the deceased themselves, all to protect their final resting place.
It shows you just how important those rituals, the offerings, that whole process of honoring the dead was to the Romans. Because if you didn't,
Let's just say you didn't want to risk the wrath of some very unhappy spirits. And we're not just talking about grumpy ancestors here. We need to talk about the Lemures. We mentioned them briefly before, but I feel like we need to dig a little deeper into this whole restless spirit situation.
yeah, the Lemures, they weren't just your average ghosts, right? Like, what made them different?
They were seen as the physical embodiment of this restless energy, the spirits of people who maybe didn't get a proper burial, who were holding on to anger or regret, or maybe even a thirst for revenge.
So definitely not the kind of guests you want showing up to your toga party. Were they like full-blown scary ghosts or more like annoying spirits?
The Romans definitely saw them as something to be afraid of. They believed the Lemures could actually haunt the living, cause mischief, make people sick, even drive them mad.
Okay, yeah, that's officially terrifying. So how did they deal with these Lemures? Did they, like, have their own version of Ghostbusters back then?
They had their own ways of dealing with these unwanted spectral guests. Remember that festival of Lemuria we talked about earlier?
Right. The one where they walked around their homes at night, throwing beans over their shoulders? I gotta say, that always seemed a little weird to me.
It does sound a bit odd, I'll admit. But basically, it was this huge, citywide exorcism designed to calm these wandering spirits down and send them off to the underworld where they belonged.
Keep the spirits happy, keep them moving, and most importantly, keep them out of your house. Got it. But it makes you wonder, if the Romans could see how we handle death today, what would they think?
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? Would they understand cremation, for example? Or the idea of a Zoom funeral?
Imagine trying to explain a live stream memorial service to, like, a Roman soldier. Not sure they'd be impressed. But on a more serious note, even though we aren't leaving coins for ferrymen or throwing beans over our shoulders these days, we still have our own rituals and traditions that help us process death.
Of course we do. Visiting graves, lighting candles, telling stories about the people we've lost. It's all part of being human. This need to remember, to honor, and to keep the memory alive.
It's like we're still searching for that connection, even though death feels so final. And what's so interesting about the Romans is that you really see that impulse, that desire for connection in their beliefs about the afterlife. Like, they didn't just banish all the spirits to the underworld, right? They had the lores, those household spirits we mentioned before.
Right. The lores, they were more than just ghosts hanging out in the attic. They were protectors, guardians of the home and family. Families would actually give them offerings, little shrines, almost like they were acknowledging that the line between the living and the dead, well, it wasn't completely solid.
It's like they saw their ancestors as still being around, just in a different form, still part of the family, even after death.
And that cyclical view of life and death, it wasn't just about household spirits either. It was woven into their entire mythology, how they understood the natural world. Remember the story of Proserpina?
You mean the whole kidnapped by the god of the underworld thing?
Exactly. That
Hmm.
story, it wasn't just some dramatic myth. It was their way of explaining the seasons, the cycle of growth and decay, of life, death, and rebirth. And that cycle, it was fundamental to Roman agriculture.
So when Proserpina was down in the underworld with Pluto, that's when winter would come. And when she returned to her mother, that's when spring would arrive and everything would come back to life.
Exactly. It's such a powerful metaphor for how the Romans saw themselves as part of something bigger, something cyclical and interconnected.
And there's even more to it than that. Because Ceres, she wasn't just a heartbroken mother in that story. She was the actual embodiment of the Earth's fertility. So her emotions, her grief, they directly affected the Roman world.
Which means that even the gods weren't above those natural cycles, you see, the cycles of loss and renewal. Even in their mythology, there was this sense of order, of balance. It wasn't about trying to escape to some perfect heavenly place. It was about understanding that harmony, about recognizing that we all have a part to play in these larger cycles.
It makes the Roman underworld so much more than just this spooky, mysterious place. It becomes a reflection of their values, their fears, their whole way of understanding the world.
And that's what's so amazing about exploring the beliefs of ancient cultures, isn't it? It gives us this incredible glimpse into how they wrestled with the big questions of life.
Absolutely. So the next time you come across the Roman underworld, whether it's in a book you're reading, a movie you're watching, or even just a conversation, remember, you're not just dipping your toes into some ancient myth. You're catching a glimpse of an entire worldview, one that was deeply connected to the rhythms of nature, the power of family, and the enduring mystery of life and death.
And who knows, you might even find yourself thinking about those same questions in a whole new way. What will your legacy be? How will you be remembered? And what stories will you leave behind when it's your time to cross that river into the unknown?